Ladies and gentlemen, when I was 5 years old, a mob attacked our family farm. There was a footpath that led out to the hills behind. And I can remember my mother taking me there by the hand and saying, "We're going to play a game. If we have to come this way, we must do it without making a sound." My father at the time, I remember, was struck down by one of those diseases that chronically afflict Northern European men in the tropics. He was paper thin, wearing a dressing gown, but he was refusing to budge. And I remember him loading his revolver while my mother was trying to persuade him to leave. This was the Peru of General Velasco. It turned out that the land invasion, in our case, was unsuccessful, but the other farms in the valley were not so lucky. There was a process of general nationalization and expropriation that unfolded across that country. And as always happens, when a government declares a program of land reform, people started to take the law into their own hands, and the police, seeing which way the wind was blowing, refused to intervene. Velasco plunged Peru into a state of abject poverty from which it has only recently recovered. That was quite an experience to go through age 5, but it was only much later that the most shocking thing of all struck me, which was that no one had been especially shocked. It was taken for granted in Peru that the rule of law was contingent, that property rights were insecure, that constitutions came and went. In fact, I learned an hour or two ago from my fellow Peruvian Ian Vasquez that Latin America has produced 200 constitutions, which is quite some going and puts it in a top league in the world. Now, as I traveled back and forth between school in the UK and vacations in Lima, I pondered more and more on the difference. After all, there was no geographical or historically obvious reason for this divergence. The Americas had been settled around about the same time. The early South American revolutionaries had, in most cases, copied versions of the US Constitution. San Martin and Bolivar and their collaborators broadly saw themselves as children of the Enlightenment, as rational, scientific people. They were Freemasons in many cases. The idea that they would have been conscripted by Hugo Chavez, I think, would have horrified them if they'd been able to see into our time. So what explains this divergence? Well, let me put the question in a different way. Why has no Mexican politician ever had to propose building a wall to keep out all the gringos? Right? 160,000, more or less 160,000 Mexicans every year settle legally in the United States. By definition, we can't count how many settle there illegally. I rather agree with those of you who were listening to Bryan Caplan earlier with what he said about the benefits of migration. Everyone who made that journey was fundamentally casting a vote for optimism and showing himself to be shrewd and confident about the future. I wish we could find an answering optimism in North American politicians. I long for the day when I can hear a current US politician repeat the sentiments that Ronald Reagan, in that characteristically upbeat way he had, used to express when he said, "Every immigrant makes America more American." But still, let's ask the question, why is the traffic of people overwhelmingly one way? Why is there such a large move of population from all over Central and South America to the US and Canada, but so little in the other direction? On one level, of course, the answer is obvious. Americans take for granted things that are considered luxuries in many parts of Latin America. Things like reliable electricity supply, decent healthcare system, tarmacked roads, uncorrupt judges, regular elections. The GDP in the United States is about 6 or 7 times as much per head as in Mexico, about 10 times as much as in some of the poorer countries in this region. But why do we have that discrepancy? What's the underlying cause that produced that divergence? Is there some magical property in the air or the water, or perhaps in the gene pool of the United States, that has created this singular success and that isn't shared by the rest of the world? I don't think we can seriously sustain that thesis. In fact, if you look at the populations immediately on either side of the border, in Texas or in New Mexico or in Arizona, you find that they are pretty much the same people, breathing the same air, watching the same TV, eating the same food. In fact, in their book, Why Nations Fail, Robinson and Acemoglu begin with the twin towns of Nogales, Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Mexico. And they point out that the populations were sundered almost accidentally. There was no ethnographic border there. The people on either side of the frontier are eating the same delicious tacos and watching the same abominable telenovelas. And yet, the people in Arizona are substantially better off on every indicator, life expectancy, literacy, infant mortality, every indicator, than their cousins on the other side. What caused that discrepancy? Well, I think the first person to glimpse the answer was Alexis de Tocqueville, 180 years ago. And he put it down to what he called the point de départ, the punto de partida, the starting point. He had a theory that in the wide open spaces of the New World, people would distill and intensify the tendencies that they brought with them from their mother countries. So, as de Tocqueville saw it, French America exaggerated the seigneurialism, the obscurantism of Bourbon France. And Spanish America exaggerated the ramshackle corruption of Bourbon Spain. But English America, as he always called it, exaggerated the republicanism, the libertarianism, the localism that was incipient in parliamentary England. In fact, although Tocqueville is always quoted as a witness of American exceptionalism, he wrote a book about England as well. He was married to an English woman. He knew the Anglo-Saxon world extremely well, and he tended to think of it as a cultural continuum. He saw the US simply as a more potent distillation of what had come from the British Isles. He once wrote, "The American is the Englishman left to himself." So what was it that those early settlers brought with them? It's an apt question to ask in this quadracentenary of the Mayflower's voyage. Well, there was certainly nothing in the wealth either of the countries of origin or of the colonies that explains the disparity. Tocqueville's great English contemporary, Lord Macaulay, the Whig politician, poet, and historian, said, "We can see no way in which the Castilian at the beginning of the 17th century was inferior to the Englishman." Spain was a wealthier, more popular, more peopled, larger country, and a far more influential country in the weights councils of the world. And certainly, if you look at the resources of North and South America, North America is some way behind. It wasn't long before the silver and gold of the New World was pressing the hulls of Spanish galleons deep into the waterline, all the way until they got back to the Old World in order to be predated on and pirated by English ships, which no doubt Gabrielle would regard as an act of shocking piracy, but obviously we all reflect our national traditions. I saw it as an act of legitimate defense against a hostile power. But the point was there was no equivalent source of ready wealth at that time in North America. The settlers had brought with them between their ears a treasure that was more precious than all the silver in Tasco or in Potosi. They had brought with them a way of ordering their affairs that was uniquely well suited, both to the settling of the New World and to the building of an open society in it. In the first place, government was decentralized. Edmund Burke called it a policy of wise and salutary neglect. At least until the 1760s, England took really very little interest in what happened in North America. People were free to elect their own mayors and sheriffs, and in time, their own colonial legislatures, to pass their own laws and to levy their own taxes. It was a very different experience in Spanish America. The Crown saw this as a national enterprise in colonization. And like all autocratic institutions, it was jealous of its power. As we saw when the Jesuits were accused of building an empire within an empire and brutally repressed. They'd been leading the missionary activity, of course, in the New World, because in every authoritarian system, power is jealous. The settlers in Spanish America had tried, by and large, to replicate the vast estates of Extremadura and Andalusia, the places they'd largely come from. They adapted a system of serfdom that had first been imposed on the Moors in the years immediately following the Reconquest. It was a system known as the encomienda, and it basically divided the population into groups of people who were then obliged to give forced labor to their Spanish encomendero. And that system was really the basis of social organization for the bulk of the colonial period, and we still have its legacy visible in parts of Latin America. After a small, disastrous attempt at communal ownership in New England, very quickly people reverted to the idea of private land ownership in the names of individuals. In Virginia, from 1618, they introduced a system called the head right, which said any settler is given 50 acres plus another 50 for any family member he manages to attract. And that model of dispersed individual land ownership basically set the template for what was to happen in the United States right up through to the Homestead Acts, until the entire continent had been peopled. Now, we should acknowledge that there was a huge price paid by the indigenous population. Looking back at the writings of the settlers at the time, enlightened people by the standard of their age, it is shocking to see their indifference to the people that they were displacing. Nonetheless, that system of land ownership lent itself to an open society in which property rights were secure, in which, in the absence of a strong arbitrary central power, there was a rule of law where the individual could reasonably expect redress of grievances rather than having to lobby for political favors. And that ultimately explains the divergence. Now, here's the really important point. It wasn't South America that was the exception here. Almost the whole of the world is organized on the basis of some kind of organized exploitation for the benefit of the elite. That has been the usual form of social organization for our species for 10,000 years. The outlier was the United States. Now, why it became an outlier? Well, Gabriel mentioned that I've written a book about it called Inventing Freedom. A whole bunch of accidental factors went into it. Right? I could lecture for another hour and a half just on that. But the point is, Ernst Gellner, the sociologist and anthropologist, put it brilliantly. He said, in the whole history of agricultural humanity, this breakthrough happened only once. This elevation of the rules above the rulers and of the individual above the collective. A really exceptional system. Think about what he meant by that. Only once in the history of the last 10,000 years. 10,000 years ago, one of our ancestors made the discovery that if you put a seed in the ground, a plant will grow there, right? Major change for the whole of Homo sapiens. It takes about 5 minutes for somebody to make the next discovery, which is that it is easier to steal your neighbor's harvest than to spend all year growing your own crops. Right? And then, because man is a rapacious and greedy creature, it probably took about another 10 minutes for the really nasty discovery, which is that if you truly want to optimize the ratio of effort to outcome, you should regularize that plunder through a system of tithes and tolls and taxes. And thus was civilization born as a protection racket, as a system of organized plunder, what sociologists call the stationary bandit, the person who would move in and in exchange for a modicum of protection would run effectively a slave state. And for 10,000 years, the lot of our species was oppression and serfdom and misery and slavery. Every single one of you in this room is descended from slaves and from slave owners. The institution was universal. It was practiced on every continent. Think of human history for a moment and you see that it can't be otherwise. It's simply a question of how far back you want to go. For most of those 10,000 years, what we call history was really the history of the top 1% of the top 1%. For everybody else, it was a life of backbreaking toil from dawn to dusk in the fields, until the breakthrough came, Ernest Gellner's miracle. And what was it based on? Well, I can best answer that question by recounting a little story about Stanley Baldwin, who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom for most of the interwar period. A very pragmatic, anti-intellectual conservative. We all know the type in politics. And he was asked, towards the end of his life, he was asked, were you influenced by any theory or any philosopher? And rather to the astonishment of his interviewer, because Baldwin was not the kind of guy who read books, he said, yes, I was. I was very influenced as a young man by the teachings of Sir Henry Maine, the Victorian anthropologist and jurist. And it was through reading and studying the works of Maine that I finally came to see that all human history is a move from status to contract. And then he paused, frowning, and said, or was it the other way around? It's a cute story, because it shows that even the most brilliant ideas become worn through overuse, become overfamiliar. But just stop for a second and ponder those three words, status to contract. That up until then, on every continent, in every archipelago, human relations had been mediated by birth, by caste, by tradition. And the breakthrough was simply allowing two individuals to make freestanding agreements with each other without needing to ask the permission of the king or the bishop or anybody else, and have those agreements arbitrated by a neutral magistracy. That's it. Grant that, and everything else follows. Now think about the problems that exist in those Latin American states that have not developed a fully functioning rule of law. We heard last night about the philanthropic ogre, el ogro filantropico. Right? The basic problem is that if you're in a country where you can't reasonably expect to put a dispute with your neighbor before a court and rely on an impartial judge to give you redress of grievance, if instead you're in a place where you phone your friend who knows a general or a minister, then no one has incentives to invest. No one has incentives to trade. And all growth is limited by the failure of having secure property rights. Well, let me put that another way around. The central fact of all our lives, the thing that elevated our species to an unprecedented level of wealth, was the Industrial Revolution. And suddenly, at some moment in the 18th century, all of these guys in the West Midlands of England suddenly started inventing things. Arkwright and Watt and Boulton. Does anyone really think that all these geniuses just happened to be born at the same time in the same place, right, through some kind of coincidental cluster? Of course not. And how many Arkwrights and Boultons and Watts had lived and died as field hands in the centuries leading up to that moment? What had changed is that there was a system of secure intellectual property, a system of secure patents that allowed them to make the investments. And if you have that, almost everything else will follow. The individualism, the liberty, and the security that comes from an open society. So what can we conclude, going back to why there is a border one way but not the other? What can we conclude about the likelihood of a future approximation or divergence? If people are not, if you like, condemned by some determinism of genetics or geography, if it's simply a question of getting the right institutions, then we could, I think, reasonably, hopefully say, well, that's a very good idea. That's a very good, encouraging, optimistic story, because it means that if you replicate the institutional model, you can get the same happy outcome anywhere else. And certainly, the imposition of common law, devolved organizations of government, the security of property and of a legal system has worked where it has been transplanted, right? Those values are why Bermuda is not Haiti. Those values are why Hong Kong is not China, why Singapore is not Indonesia, why Israel isn't Syria, right? There is no geographical determinism about it. So is it the case that if Guatemala or Mexico or my native Peru were to adopt the same legal institutions and the mores that go with it, that over time they would enjoy the same benefits that Americans take for granted? Well, to some extent it is, and to some extent, of course, that's been happening. It's a natural thing for all libertarians to be pessimistic, especially about their own country. I've noticed every conference I've gone to, even the people who come from Singapore and Hong Kong are moaning about how big the government is and how intrusive the state is. You hear it all the time. Oh, but if you actually lived in my country, you'd see what a terrible... No, you're from Switzerland. You really don't have a problem. People would gladly swap their problems for yours, right? Things are better than they were in most places. But just think about the reverse. Let me leave you with a rather eerie thought. If the United States is the outlier, isn't there equally a danger of a reversion to the mean? Think of the third law of thermodynamics, right? Things tend back to the basic entropic state that they began from. A liberal society, an open society, a society based on the primacy of the individual is deeply unnatural. It is an unnatural construct that has to be maintained against the entropic pressures trying to drag it back to reversion, right? And what I mean by that is it doesn't come naturally to any of us. Human beings evolved in tribes and in kin groups. We think collectively. We have, left to ourselves, rather scary notions of when it is right to brutalize or oppress others. Think about the history of the human race for a moment, and that becomes indubitable. So the reason that we've been able, in parts of the world, to carve out this space where you have limited government, accountable politicians, secure property rights, uncensored newspapers, regular elections, all the rest of it, is because people have been educated, taught a series of values that don't come naturally. In particular, we've been taught the difficult and unnatural but important idea that someone we don't like might still have something useful to say. Empiricism, rationalism, the whole basis of the Enlightenment depends on constant education. And this is why the two organizations represented here at this conference are so critically important. Because if the role of our education system was to create and make possible an Enlightenment society, to teach people the primacy of free will and individual thought, to teach people status rather than contract, to teach people that we're not all defined by physiognomy or birth or accident of caste, but that we're all responsible for our own actions. You've got to ask yourself, is that what people are still being taught? Right? When I look at what's happening, particularly in universities throughout the West, but I think it's now happening in secondary schools as well, it's very difficult to avoid the rather scary conclusion that instead of teaching the counter-cyclical notion that the individual matters more than the collective and that we are all responsible for ourselves, people are being taught the pro-cyclical notion, the notion that appeals to our Paleolithic DNA, that says, actually, no, you are defined by accident of birth. The single most important thing about you is your race or your gender or your sexual preference. Collectivism has made a terrifying comeback in the form of identity politics. A lot of the academics who uphold that way of looking at the world call themselves postmodernists. Postmodernism meaning effectively that they think that the truth is a product of power structures rather than being some fixed external gauge. But I think a more accurate way of describing their philosophy is pre-modernism. It's a reversion to the pre-Enlightenment idea of tribalism. And if you're looking for a short explanation of why politics around the world has become so polarized and angry, look no further than our basic tribal instincts. We're obeying the promptings buried deep in our genome that worked very well on the savannas of Pleistocene Africa, but perhaps not so well today. And in an age when universities are expanding, when a higher and higher proportion of the population is being subjected to this indoctrination, and when the indoctrination is becoming more and more intense, we need an antidote. We need someone to tell the truth. And there are two ways, it seems to me, that you could do that. One is the UFM route. You create your own universities. You create places where there is genuine heterodoxy. Not universities that just teach right-wing ideas, but universities that teach people the importance of the scientific method, the importance of reason, the primacy of logic, and the sanctity of the individual. I'd love to see many more UFMs in many more countries. But, as your founder understood, it's a long-term project. It takes a while to build up a corpus of graduates who can make a big impact. Which brings me to the second organization. Another way in, shortcutting the foundation of a whole new university, important though that is to try and reach some of the people who are currently being subjected to indoctrination in all of the other universities and show them that there is another way of looking at the world. And this is where Reason excels, both in its messaging and in its presentation. Ways of reaching a generation raised with screens and short attention spans. Let me just finish by saying, from the bottom of my heart, thank you to all of those of you involved either with UFM or with Reason for fighting this most important of battles. It's no exaggeration to say that you are defending the liberal order. You are defending what we understand by Western civilization. And that is a battle that is never going to be definitively won, because everyone coming new to the argument is going to come from the other side. Hannah Arendt had a nice phrase. She said, every generation, Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. And of course, think about it, right? You and I came into the world pretty much with the same mental makeup as our ancestors would have done 50,000 or 100,000 years ago. The reason we don't live the way they did is because of things we have learned, because we've been acculturated, habituated to think in a particular way, and because we're able to benefit from this extraordinary world where there is specialization, exchange, and the ability to draw on the knowledge of others. All of that feels unnatural because it is unnatural. On a deep genetic level, we are still roaming in Africa, and the world of skyscrapers and superabundance is utterly alien to us. And in every generation, people protest against it. It feels wrong. It feels alienating. There's got to be more to life than all of these material concerns. Surely it matters much more to be spiritual or to be brave or to be self-sacrificing. You know, we don't want to live purely defined by material prosperity. That was the motivation of the Romantics, of the existentialists, of revolutionary socialism, of fascism, of every anti-modern creed. And it will keep coming back because it is the anguished cry of your inner caveman, unable to come to terms with the extraordinary good fortune of being born in a world like this. So UFM and Reason, please keep alive the work, keep intact that extraordinary and precious heritage that we have been privileged to be heirs to, and ensure that we pass it on securely to our children.